there is a photograph taken near the Colosseum in the summer of 2023. Not of the Colosseum itself. Every photograph of the Colosseum looks the same, which is part of the problem. This photograph is of the street beside it, a road that was dug open for an archaeological survey in 2019, then dug open again for a water main in 2021, then partially repaved in 2022 in a way that left a raised seam across the tarmac sharp enough to damage a car's suspension, which nobody repaired because the contract for the repaving was disputed between two municipal departments whose jurisdictions overlapped in a way that the relevant legislation had never resolved. 4 years later, the seam is still there. Tourists step over it on their way to one of the most visited monuments on Earth. Locals drive around it when they can, and the city of Rome, which has been continuously inhabited for 27 centuries, has not yet determined which office is responsible for fixing a crack in a road next to the Colosseum. That image was not a crisis. It did not appear in any newspaper. It was not the subject of a government investigation or an urban planning emergency. It was Tuesday in Rome, but if you understand what that road represents, not as an infrastructure failure, which it also is, but as a diagnostic symptom, then you already understand something about Rome that its tourist board, its national government, and its considerable mythology are structurally incapable of saying out loud. The city is not simply in decline, the city is paralyzed by its own weight. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a problem that can be solved and one that cannot. If you have been watching cities like Rome carefully, cities that carry civilizational mass so dense it distorts every institutional decision made inside them, you already sense that what is happening here goes deeper than corruption or mismanagement or the specific failures of any particular administration. Subscribe. Empire Falls documents the structural decay that tourism revenue and classical mythology have made it professionally dangerous to describe honestly. Rome has been dying in this particular way for longer than most people who visit it realize. The difficulty, as with all cities that decline magnificently, is that Rome has always looked magnificent while dying. It perfected that particular skill 2,000 years ago and has never lost it. The light on the Forum at 6 in the morning is still one of the most extraordinary sights available to a human being in a European city. The Pantheon, unreinforced concrete poured in the 2nd century, still stands without scaffolding while modern buildings erected 60 years ago crumble around it. Rome does not look like a city in decline. That is the most important fact about Rome's decline. The numbers are clinical and worth stating plainly. The population of the city of Rome peaked at approximately 2.9 million people in the 1980s. By 2023, it had fallen to roughly 2.6 million, a decline of over 300,000 residents across 4 decades in a city that has added almost no net productive economic capacity in the same period. The historic center, the area within the ancient Aurelian walls, the Rome that tourists visit, has lost approximately 40% of its residential population since 1970. In the Trastevere district, once one of the most densely inhabited working-class neighborhoods in urban Italy, permanent resident numbers have fallen by more than half in a generation, replaced first by students, then by short-term rentals, and then by the silence of a neighborhood that is full of people and empty of community simultaneously. Rome's GDP per capita ranks below the average of northern Italian cities, below Milan by a margin that has been widening since the 1990s, and below a growing list of Spanish and German cities that would have been considered comparisons of flattery rather than competition 20 years ago. The city that was once the administrative center of the world's most powerful empire is now, measured by economic productivity, a mid-tier European regional capital that happens to be extraordinarily beautiful, the infrastructure of a civilization without the civilization. What makes this more than a story about urban demographic drift is what it reveals about how Rome functions, or more precisely, how it fails to function as a living city. Because Rome has not simply lost residents. It has lost the category of resident that cities require in order to generate the political will to fix themselves. The young professional who leaves Rome for Milan at 26, who earns twice the salary, and navigates a city that does not take 40 minutes to cross by bus because the bus system has not been meaningfully upgraded since the 1970s, that person does not return. Not because they do not love Rome, Many of them speak about it with a specific quality of grief that anyone who has left a beautiful and broken place will recognize immediately. But because Rome cannot offer them the thing that cities are supposed to offer the people in the middle of their productive lives, the reasonable expectation that tomorrow will function better than today, Rome instead offers them the opposite, a reasonable expectation that tomorrow will function at roughly the same level as today, and that the level at which today functions was established some time ago and has not been a subject of serious improvement since. The buses arrive when they arrive. The permits take as long as they take. The archaeological survey that blocked the side street near your office will be completed when the funding cycle permits, unless the funding cycle is redirected to a different priority, which it will be because Rome operates under 17 layers of overlapping jurisdictional authority in which the question of who is responsible for any given problem has a guaranteed answer. Not us. The specific successor in Rome's case is not tourism, though tourism has made everything worse in the particular way that money always makes structural dysfunction worse, by providing enough revenue to sustain the dysfunction while removing the urgency to fix it. The specific accelerant is the weight of the past itself, not as a metaphor, as a literal operational reality. Rome cannot build a metro line without finding a Roman temple. It cannot lay a broadband cable without uncovering a necropolis. It cannot repair a water main without triggering an archaeological preservation order that halts the repair for 6 months while a survey is conducted, after which the survey findings must be reviewed by a separate commission whose recommendation goes to a municipal office that may or may not be the office with jurisdiction over the relevant piece of infrastructure, depending on which layer of legislation created that infrastructure and which subsequent layer of legislation modified the jurisdictional arrangement. Rome has, by some estimates, 60% of the world's classical antiquities beneath its streets. That extraordinary inheritance has made the city simultaneously the most historically significant urban environment in the Western world and the most institutionally paralyzed major city in Western Europe. Every repair becomes an excavation. Every excavation becomes a preservation order. Every preservation order becomes a bureaucratic process that outlasts the administration that initiated it. And the city does not get fixed. If you find this kind of structural analysis valuable, the kind that the institutions living inside the problem cannot afford to conduct on themselves, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that this investigation deserves to reach the people looking for it. The testimony coming from practitioners inside Rome's institutional apparatus is consistent, and when people speak honestly, rather than for the record or for the press release, candid to the point of exhaustion. A municipal engineer who spent 15 years working on infrastructure projects in the historic center described the operational reality in terms that were difficult to argue with. Every project, he said, takes 3 to 4 times as long as the same project would take in any other Italian city, not because the workers are less competent or the funding is necessarily less available, but because at every stage of every project, there is a point at which someone discovers that the relevant authority is unclear, the relevant legislation is contradictory, or the relevant archaeological consideration requires a review that was not built into the original timeline. And the review always takes longer than projected, because the reviewing body has 14 other reviews in progress for the same reason. Rome is not broken, Rome is correct. It is correctly applying a system that was designed for a city that did not need to function at the speed that modern cities require. The data from Rome's infrastructure performance confirms this account. Rome's metro system has two functional lines, Line A, opened in 1980, and Line B, opened in 1990, plus a partial Line C that has been under construction since 2006 and remains incomplete at a cost that has exceeded 5 billion euros and a timeline that has been revised upwards 7 times. For context, Madrid built an equivalent length of new metro in 4 years in the late 1990s. Rome has not completed one metro extension in 20, not because Rome lacks engineers or funding in isolation, but because every kilometer of tunnel has encountered the archaeological reality beneath the city, and the institutional response to that archaeological reality has been consistently to pause rather than to resolve. The history that explains Rome's current condition is, of course, Roman. And understanding it requires confronting an irony so complete that it becomes structurally significant. Rome was the city that invented the concept of administrative capacity at scale. The Roman Empire governed territories from Scotland to Mesopotamia through a system of roads, laws, and provincial administration that was, for its time, the most sophisticated governance apparatus the world had produced. Rome knew how to make things work. Rome had made the entire known world work for 300 years through the quality and discipline of its administrative machinery. What the empire discovered in the 3rd century and what the city has been rediscovering in slower motion ever since is that administrative capacity is not heritable. The machinery that governed the Roman world required constant maintenance, constant renewal of the human capital that operated it, constant willingness to reform systems that had stopped working before the cost of their failure became catastrophic. When the 3rd century emperors began to find that reform was politically more dangerous than maintaining the dysfunctional system, Rome began its long descent. Not through conquest, not through plague, though both came, but through the accumulation of institutional decisions that prioritized the stability of the existing arrangement over the functionality of the city and empire it was supposed to serve. Constantinople survived because it reformed. It shed Roman administrative rigidity and replaced it with something more adaptive. What remained in Rome calcified, and the Western Empire fell not in a single catastrophic event, Gibbon notwithstanding, but through 3 centuries of accumulated institutional paralysis in which the cost of maintaining the system exceeded the benefit of belonging to it, while no one with the authority to change the system had the political incentive to do so. Modern Rome is not repeating that history. It is experiencing its structural afterimage. The institutions that govern Rome today are not the same institutions that governed the empire, but they operate under the same fundamental constraint that the weight of what Rome has been makes it extraordinarily difficult to decide what Rome should become. Here is the counterintuitive conclusion that Rome's considerable mythology makes almost impossible to state in an official context. Rome is not declining despite its history. Rome is declining because of it. The 2,000-year accumulation of monuments, laws, jurisdictions, preservation orders, cultural significance, and institutional memory that makes Rome the most historically extraordinary city in the Western world is the same accumulation that makes it functionally unable to operate as a modern city at the speed and competence that modern urban life requires. The history is not the solution to Rome's problems. The history is the problem. Not the history itself. The history is extraordinary and irreplaceable and genuinely worth the considerable inconvenience of its preservation. What is the problem is the institutional arrangement that has grown up around the history, the 17 layers of overlapping authority, the preservation orders that cannot be resolved because resolving them would require a political coalition that no administration has been able to hold together long enough to act. Rome knows this. The municipal government has known it for decades. There have been commissions and reports and master plans, each one producing a document that was technically accurate and institutionally unimplementable, because implementing it would require dismantling the very apparatus of overlapping jurisdictions that has sustained itself by being indispensable to the resolution of the conflicts it generates. The reform that would fix Rome requires the consent of the bodies that benefit from Rome remaining unfixed. That is not corruption in the simple sense. It is the institutional logic of a city that has been governing itself in continuous overlapping layers for 27 centuries without ever fully resolving the contradictions between them. And tourism, the industry that was supposed to compensate for the city's economic underperformance and provide the revenue that would fund the modernization that never quite arrived. Tourism has not fixed Rome. Tourism has given Rome the resources to avoid fixing itself. The 45 million tourists who visit Rome each year generate revenue that flows primarily to the hospitality sector, the short-term rental market, and the network of private operators who manage access to the monuments. It does not flow, in proportions sufficient to matter, to the metro line that has been under construction since 2006, or to the bus fleet that has not been meaningfully modernized in 2 decades, or to the school buildings in the peripheral neighborhoods whose structural condition would constitute a scandal in any northern European city. Tourism funds the stage set. It does not fund the city behind the stage set. The residents who remain in Rome's historic center understand this with the particular clarity that comes from living inside the contradiction every day. You do not need a long conversation with a Roman who grew up in Testaccio or Pineto or the Prati neighborhood, who watched the neighborhood bar where their family had drunk coffee for 3 generations close when the owner retired and the rent at renewal exceeded what any local business could sustain, who navigates a public transport system that treats their daily commute as a low priority operational inconvenience, who has made the calculation, not in bitterness, most of them, but in the cold arithmetic of daily life, that the city is consuming more of their energy than it is returning in quality of life. They do not need that conversation to tell you what the population data already shows. They are leaving, slowly, without drama. One family, one professional, one young person who chose Milan over staying at a time. What comes next is the question that Rome's tourism board and its national government and its considerable literary and cinematic tradition of celebrating its own beautiful dysfunction are not designed to answer. On current trajectories, the historic center continues to depopulate, its residential fabric replaced by short-term accommodation serving a tourist economy that requires the appearance of authentic Roman life without the infrastructure cost of sustaining actual Roman life. The peripheral neighborhoods, Tor Bella Monaca, Corviale, the vast residential sprawl built in the 1960s and 1970s to house the population that the city center could no longer absorb, continue to operate with the infrastructure of provisoriality, the temporary solution that became permanent because permanence requires a political decision that nobody had the tenure or the coalition to make. Rome faces a choice it has been deferring for 40 years and cannot defer much longer. It can attempt genuine institutional reform, the consolidation of jurisdictions, the resolution of the archaeological preservation framework into something that allows infrastructure to move at a speed compatible with modern urban life, the construction of the political coalition required to actually complete Line C of the metro system before 2040. Or it can accept the trajectory it is on. A city of extraordinary beauty and growing dysfunction, magnificent to visit, progressively more difficult to inhabit, increasingly dependent on the revenue of people who come to consume its history, and decreasingly capable of providing the services that the people who live its history require. The first path requires a kind of political courage that Rome has not produced in 40 years of trying. The second path produces, in a generation, something that has appeared before in cities that confused heritage with vitality, that monetized their mythology until the mythology was the only functioning economic sector, that replaced living culture with the performance of living culture, and discovered, too late, that the audience for a performance is less forgiving than the community that created it. There is something worth naming precisely about what is happening in Rome that goes beyond any single city's story. Rome is the most extreme case of a phenomenon that is visible, in earlier stages, in every city whose identity rests more heavily on what it was than on what it is becoming. The weight of the past is not always an asset. Sometimes it is the most effective mechanism of institutional paralysis available. Sometimes the history is not the foundation. Sometimes the history is the ceiling. The question that Rome poses, and that every city with a powerful historical identity eventually has to answer, is not whether to preserve the past. Preservation is not in question. The question is whether it is possible to carry the past as an asset without being immobilized by it as a burden, whether a city can honor what it was while still being capable of becoming something, whether the monuments and the laws and the jurisdictions and the preservation orders and the 2,000-year accumulation of institutional memory can coexist with a functioning metro system and a reliable bus and a road beside the Colosseum that someone is clearly responsible for repairing. Rome's answer to that question right now is not encouraging, but it is not yet final. There are still engineers trying to complete the metro line. There are still administrators attempting to rationalize the jurisdictional tangle. There are still residents who have chosen to stay, not because the calculation resolves in their favor, but because the city is theirs in a way that no short-term rental guest and no day tripper can replicate, and because they have not yet accepted that the beautiful and the functional are, in Rome's case, permanently incompatible. That argument is getting harder to make every year. The window in which it remains theoretically winnable is narrowing faster than any of the institutions responsible for keeping it open are prepared to admit. Tell us in the comments which city you think carries this same burden, the city whose history has become its paralysis, whose past is so heavy that its future cannot move. Empire Falls is already looking at the next one. And the pattern, as always, was visible long before the institutions were willing to name it. Empires do not fall in a day. They fall under the weight of what they were.